I want to talk about the Christmas Day bombing. Another Christmas story. The Christmas Day bombings in 1972. Richard Nixon actually got elected in '68 by saying that he would bring peace with honor after 4 years of being in office. They were nowhere near actually getting out of Vietnam. So in '72, there's an election. George McGovern was against the war. That was his single issue. He was a single-issue candidate. He was against the war, running against Nixon. Eventually, Nixon forced some Paris peace talks with North Vietnam and said that peace was at hand. So that's what Nixon did. Nixon essentially made negotiations in order to end the war. He wanted to keep his presidency. He wanted to hold on to that power. So in order to crush George McGovern, I mean, remember, '68 was when RFK got assassinated. So RFK fucking dead. So now we got Nixon. And then '72, we had a bright, shining moment of hope with George McGovern. George McGovern got fucked too. So that's, Richard Nixon gets reelected, and then the Christmas Day bombings of '72 began on December 18th, going all the way to December 29th. Nixon actually didn't bomb on Christmas, but they were dubbed the Christmas bombings. The idea was to force North Vietnam, because the peace talks somehow failed or they were floundering, and so Nixon wanted to force them back to the negotiating table because he was worried, and so were the Vietnamese, that in January the Congress was going to cut off funding, and so therefore they didn't even have to deal with Nixon. They could have just waited until Congress had met in January. So here's the details. Beginning on December 18th, American B-52s and fighter bombers dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on the cities of Hanoi and Hapyeong. The United States lost 15 of its giant B-52s and 11 other aircraft during the attack. 15 of them and 11 others. So, I mean, there was losses by the United States. North Vietnamese claimed that over 1,600 civilians were killed. The bombings continued until December 29th, at which time the North Vietnamese agreed to resume the talks. A few weeks later, the final Paris Peace Treaty was signed, and the Vietnam War came to a close, ending the U.S. role in a conflict that was seriously damaged the domestic Cold War consensus among the American public. The impact of the so-called Christmas bombings on the final agreement was difficult to assess. Some historians have argued that the bombings forced the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table. Others have suggested that the attacks had little impact beyond the additional death and destruction they caused. Even the chief U.S. negotiator, Henry Kissinger, was reported to say, "We bombed the North Vietnamese into accepting our concessions." The chief impact may have been in convincing America's South Vietnamese allies, who were highly suspicious of the draft treaty worked out in October 1972, that the United States would not desert them. In any event, the final treaty did not include any important changes from the October draft. So the October draft, they had October peace treaties, but there wasn't many changes. Supposedly they forced them back to the table, but I don't know. I mean, I guess it's a mixture of whatever. And then we didn't, Vietnam, we actually don't get out of Vietnam for another 3 years. Nixon is resigns in disgrace, for the whole Watergate breaking in the Democratic headquarters and shit. So that's, 3 years later after supposedly he was going to get out. So it takes 3 fucking years. And this Vietnam War, the Vietnam War was Eisenhower. Eisenhower had people, Truman had people, JFK had people in it. The United States was taken over for the French. The French had occupied it for many years, and then the Vietnamese were fighting the French, and then the United States, in the beginning with Eisenhower, Truman, and JFK, they had sent a bunch of military advisors. So they sent all these advisors, and a lot of military advisors, and if you have 50,000 military advisors, they're not just advising, right? But eventually it doesn't become a full-blown war. Never was declared, but LBJ got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed. there was some attack, some bullshit lie, Gulf of Tonkin, and then he appealed to the American public, and then Congress gives him unilateral authority to do as he pleases, and then that's when the bombings really intensified. That's when the war, really got into it. So here's a little bit more information. U.S. foreign policy and secret negotiations that excluded South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. Kissinger and North Vietnam agreed to a ceasefire, U.S. removal of all troops, and the National Council to oversee democratic elections in the South. The ceasefire, however, was a ceasefire in place, meaning that up to 300,000 North Vietnamese troops could stay in South Vietnam. The elections never took place. U.S. did eventually remove all the troops when Congress cut off the funding in '75 under the Ford administration. Overall, 500,000 to 4 million Vietnamese were killed. And then 75, the reason why I know 75 was because it's very dramatic how the United States lost the Vietnam War was because all the soldiers were running up on the building and then, I don't know, Operation Flurry or something with the helicopters just getting all the military personnel to get the fuck out. And as soon as they were doing that, then the North Vietnamese came in, and that was the fall of Saigon. So the fall of Saigon was the end of the Vietnam War, but this had started from 1954 to 1975, 21 years, that the conflict, which, some people says it was just a police action because no war was ever declared, even though 500,000 to 4 million Vietnamese, were genocided, were fucking killed. That's a shit ton of 4 million fucking people. That's insanity. That's so many people. So that was the October agreement. The secret negotiations, right? The South Vietnamese president was worried about it. And actually, even JFK had authorized an assassination program for the Southern Vietnamese leader, too. And Ho Chi Minh had appealed to the president. This was, the Vietnam War was their revolution, their war of independence. It was nation building. The United States fought against the British Empire, and then we declared our independence. The Vietnamese did the exact same thing. They fought against an empire and declared their independence. And it's also really weird when I think about the bombing and the war, the way, how we're an empire today, which I want to get to in a minute. I want to keep on actually talking about more of the facts here. So, Kissinger announced on October 26, 1972, peace is at hand. Peace is at hand. We're almost going to do it. So then Nixon winds up winning all the fucking states, and then he's re-elected, right? So it's fucking, the 1960s, peace, love, black power, hippies, the sexual revolution, all these things were happening during the 60s, but Nixon got elected once, got elected twice, and he even passed the EPA. So Nixon might have been the last liberal Republican that we have. The Republicans that we got today actually make Nixon look like a socialist. But Nixon couldn't accept failure of the peace initiative. The announcement handed Nixon a landslide victory. George McGovern based his entire campaign on an anti-war platform, and that's what Nixon said, well, fuck it, I'm just going to... So George McGovern, while losing, affected U.S. policy, and we wouldn't have got out of Vietnam. I mean, we haven't even got out of Germany yet, and I'm pretty sure Hitler's dead. Hitler is fucking dead, but we still have troops occupying Germany. It seems like once we put our military base there, we never leave. So the 11 days... minus the Christmas Day, okay? So it's called the Christmas Day bombings because it happened from the 18th to the 29th, but Nixon didn't want it to be called the Christmas bombing because that sounds so horrible, right, to bomb people on Christmas. But I think they're mostly Buddhist, and so Buddhists, they don't even celebrate Christianity. But for the American public, it doesn't sound good to be bombing people on Christmas. 1914, there's a truce in World War I. But George Washington actually invaded Trenton, and killed the Hessians, the Washington crossing the Delaware, right? That's one of the most famous sort of propaganda paintings, which was painted actually like way after, like 100 years afterwards. So that's another Christmas story, right? Washington attacking Trenton. But Let's see. So what happened? B-52s, tactical fighter bombers, flew 729 sorties over North Vietnam, dropping 15,000 tons of bombs and hitting some 1,600 military targets. They destroyed rail tracks and cars, some 3 million gallons of fuel in airfields, and they knocked out an estimated 80% of the country's electric supply capacity. So that's shit ton of 15,000 tons, right? 729 sorties, tactical fighter bombers, B-52s, rail tracks, cars, 3 million gallons of fuel, airfields. The 1,600 civilians were also killed. Dan Rather reported it as a terror campaign, so that's terrorism. In fact, that's large-scale terrorism, right? It's not just one guy putting a bomb on him and blowing himself up, killing a couple people, but it's, you know, large-scale bombs, B-52s, aircraft bombing the shit out of everybody, but mostly it was the strip of Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam. So North Vietnamese forces responded with anti-aircraft fire, MiG fighters, and nearly 900 surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. 24 of those SAMs hit their targets, but they downed only 15 aircraft. 10 were B-52s. So, assessment, this is U.S. Foreign Policy at About.com. The Christmas bombing had the result Nixon wanted. By December 26th, North Vietnam was indicating its willingness to return to negotiations. On December 29th, Nixon halted the bombing. In January 1973, Nixon and Kissinger announced that the U.S. and North Vietnam had signed a peace treaty which was basically unchanged from the October 1972 version. By the end of January, American prisoners of war were returning home, and by March, the American combat experience in Vietnam was over. I don't really know exactly what the fuck that means because the war goes on for another 3 years, and I don't know if there was any elections that actually took place. North Vietnam did not consider the Christmas bombing a defeat. Rather, it was just another step in its conquest of South Vietnam. With the U.S. out of the way, communists were able to take the South in 1975. Nevertheless, Nixon could claim victory by using force as evidence that the U.S. was not weak. He had secured a diplomatic end to the divisive Vietnam War. So, North Vietnam's actually a whole thing. They weren't even trying to win battles. They couldn't win battles, you know. They just kept on sending peasants after peasants, and it was a national movement. So it was about fighting for your homeland, fighting for your country, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. And so it wasn't just, you know, a military thing, but it was actually hearts and minds. The Vietnamese, with their heart and minds and souls, really wanted to fight and engage in this war. Also, America is a first world power, and Vietnam was a third world power. So a third world power with not many weapons and lots of poor peasantry was able to beat you know, the United States of America. Che Guevara says we need to have 1,000 of Vietnams or hundreds of Vietnams. The operation was called Operation Linebacker. B-52s, they saw the largest heavy bomber strikes launched by the U.S. Air Force since the end of World War II. Linebacker 2 is a modified extension of the Operation Linebacker bombings conducted from May to October with the new emphasis of a new campaign shifted to attacks by B-52 Stratofortress heavy bombers rather than small tactical fighter aircraft. Okay, so this is a Christmas Day story. During Christmas in 1972, there's this intense bombing. Again, it seems like you don't know what the fucking truce was, right? America eventually fucking loses 3 years later. Saigon falls. So the Vietnam War was lost. What did we have to gain by bombing more fucking people? Nixon wanted to take credit for getting out of the war. Congress would have ended it in January. You know, they cut off all the funding in 75, so the end of the war was coming anyways. He had promised it as his campaign promise right at the very end of his campaign, so, you know, took George McGovern's thunder. That was his main issue, and so if Nixon was going to do the same thing as McGovern, then why vote for McGovern? The overall, I guess my overall sort of understanding of this is it's fucking crazy. It's fucking crazy to think about how the 60s and 70s were compared to today. Hunter S. Thompson had mentioned this, but the Americans had thrown out 2 presidents over a shitty war that they didn't like. LBJ, Nixon. So, you know, Nixon eventually, Watergate and all that shit, but he was not liked. People didn't like him. And LBJ resigned because of the war. Didn't resign, but he wouldn't, you know, go to the next level. He wouldn't have a re-election, so he wouldn't run for re-election over the war. And even though 2 presidents got kicked out of the Vietnam War, think about the war today. We have a war on terror. We've had a war on terror for the last 14 years strong, right? This is one of a declared war, one of the longest declared wars ever. This is the longest war in American history. Civil War is 4 years, World War II is 4 years, American Revolution 7 years, so 14 fucking years, right? We've been going at war against terror and invisible fucking ideology, and war is terror, so it doesn't even fucking make any damn sense. But it allows us to be an empire to strike anybody across the world who we fucking please without the United Nations approval. The reason why we have the United Nations, and I just heard a speech and I should check it out, but the very beginning of the United Nations Charter was to prevent one country from invading another country. The United Nations was installed to make sure that war never happened again. When one country invades a sovereign nation, then that's bullshit, and the United Nations steps in and says that it's bullshit. So that's the whole point of the United Nations. That was the point of the Greatest Generation. That's why they put the United Nations in place. But when we went into Iraq and did the war on terror, the United Nations was against it. We didn't wait for them. It was a unilateral action, and nobody did anything about it. So America got away with it. So we're an empire. We're an empire. We can bomb whoever the fuck we want, as long as we don't bomb one of the major powers, right? As long as we bomb third world poor countries without nuclear weapons. Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were the axis of evil, but North Korea's got nukes. What the fuck are you going to do with nukes, right? You're going to start a nuclear war? And so it's a really weird age that we're bombing everybody. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen. We're meddling in Syria. In Bush's era, we bombed Somalia. So it's really a weird era because we have a strong anti-war, sentiment. The anti-war movement did a lot of, it opened the door for all the other movements in the 60s. But today, where is the anti-war movement? Obama was elected, then the anti-war protest just fucking died. It just died. So in a way, Obama served as a tamper, or a temper, what do you call that, when you sort of slow the gas if you're driving something and you can only drive so far. He essentially was that role. I don't know the word of it, but it's instead of when you push on the gas and it giving it all of it's got, it calibrates or something, I don't know, but it slows it down. So that's what Obama effectively was. And Obama, when it comes to war, he's been the drone strike president, attacking lots of people, lots of civilians with the drone strikes. And we have a Libya war. We're trying to get out of Iraq. Now it seems like we're trying to get back in. Afghanistan's supposed to get out, 2016, now it's 2020. So we just keep extending this shit. And I don't know if the American people are just, we're an empire, so fuck it, we can't do anything about it. When before, the whole point of the Vietnamese strategy was just to wait the Americans out because they would grow weary of war. Why do you want to keep on attacking Vietnam? Why is Vietnam so goddamn important? Because of communism? Because of an ideology? Because they want to give bread to the poor? They want the state to control their economy? That's why the fuck we're bombing, an ideology, which is, tremendously fucked up. It's fucked up. And, that was Ho Chi Minh's strategy, and eventually worked. And one last thing I guess I'm going to mention, the audio. I listened to the audio of when Kissinger and Nixon were talking about this, and it was pretty interesting, actually, because Nixon was saying, well, when we do this, right, we're going to be bombing. We just said that we were going to go for peace, and now we're bombing the fuck out of him, right? He just won the election, so he could be like a little kitten right before the election. I'll get out of the war, and then as soon as he got reelected, he was like, kill, murder, bomb, blow everybody up. And when the audio of Kissinger and Nixon were talking about it, he said the press was the enemy. The press, right? They were against him, and they're the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. Professors are the enemy. He feels like he should have wrote that on the blackboard 100 times. Professors, press, and the establishment. So it's weird that Nixon actually was against the establishment too. The 60s. Hippies were against the establishment, and Nixon's against the establishment. So what the fuck? What establishment are we talking about here? There's clearly, the president is the head of the establishment, but you could chop off the head, but that still leaves the body. And what does that mean? Who's the body? The administration, the administrators, the shadowy, invisible group that controls everybody. So I thought that was just an interesting thing because, Nixon is saying the press, professors, and the establishment are the enemy. So, poor Nixon, oh yeah, and the very last thing I'm going to mention is that we invaded Vietnam. We invaded Vietnam just like we invaded Iraq. So, and people want to say, well, it was, they were fighting in the war. No, it was France had been occupying it, and then we invaded it and installed a puppet government. The South Vietnamese president administration was completely American. So it was an invasion, but, we've been invading fucking people for quite some time. So I think we're living in a whole nother fucking age right now. We're the American empire. I don't see an anti-war movement. I don't see this actually fucking stopping. At all. Maybe Bernie Sanders might do something different if he was to get elected in there. Hillary and all the rest of the fucking Republicans, none of them are going to do anything about it. And that kind of disappoints me. I mean, it's depressing. I believe that as a republic, we would be better off than as an empire. Empire doesn't help me give the United Nations the authority that it has. They're not going to invade our fucking country. The United Nations is just there to make sure one nation doesn't invade another nation. And so instead of having Americas with its, hands and tentacles and all these different places, we're going to piss people off by doing that. By having a world agency, the United Nations' only fucking authority, right, is embassy and peace and trade and shit like that, but it's to prevent one country from attacking another country. One sovereign nation cannot attack another sovereign nation. The United Nations have chastised Israel and the United States many times, especially Grenada and a lot of the things that Reagan was doing in Nicaragua. So, we need to listen. When the whole fucking world is telling us something, we need to listen to them. The United Nations has no teeth without the American military, so that's why we get away with doing whatever the fuck we want to. We don't even pay the United Nations dues. So we treat the United Nations with contempt since we're the main supplier of the military. But once America's on board, then the world, it's easier to get the whole world on board. But it's, the United Nations is the world, it's a forum for the world, and it provides some type of process, some sort of legal framework for how to prevent one country from invading another country. That was the legacy of the greatest generation. That was the legacy of World War II, that they established the United Nations. So, the World War I and World War II were complete breakdowns of Western civilization. We're supposed to be a civilized nation. We do things better. Then why the fuck are we just murdering each other like crazy? World War II was the peak of Western civilization, but what did we do with all that scientific progress? We turned it into weapons and guns, and we just started killing, as many people as we could. So I think we shouldn't do that anymore. I think it'd be better as a republic, United Nations. We give the United Nations the authority that the World War II generation had given them. Us being an empire, that's Hitler, Napoleon bullshit. And I don't want to be the world's policeman. We're not very good at it. Boko Haram is bombing the fuck out of people. We didn't intervene in Sudan. So we're not good as the world's policemen. We don't do these humanitarian missions. It seems like we only invade nations when there's something to gain out of it, to steal their oil or resources or land or what the fuck ever. And so since we're not very good at being the world's policemen, we're very selfish, and we fucked Iraq. It's a total mess up. So it's, put it on the United Nations, and then that's a world governing body. And let's just take care of our own borders. Instead of spending trillions on bombs, let's spend trillions on ourselves. If we spent trillions on, education, healthcare, even if we all could have cars and laptops, and it'd be fucking incredible fucking place. Japan runs a deficit 3 times their GDP. We only have a 1-to-1, so we could actually borrow more money, and we can invest in ourselves. And it's crazy that people are shitty about food stamps, but don't mind, spending all this fucking money to blow up the fucking world. And we need to acknowledge that we're an empire. We're an empire. 900 military bases, 150 countries. France, the people in France just say, oh, the empire. They don't call us America. The empire is doing this. We're an empire. So that would be, Luke Skywalker would be fighting against us if we were, Darth Vader. He fought against the empire. So whether or not we're a good or bad empire might be able to be debated. But in general, I'm anti-imperialist. Bring our troops home. protect our own borders. Let's, we got the oceans. We got the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. They protected us for a long-ass time. 9/11 happened because we keep fucking with them over there. They didn't just want to fuck with us for no reason because they're jealous of our freedoms. It's because we occupy in Saudi Arabia. We allow Israel to blow up and kill Palestinians and some things in Iraq and shit. But the occupation of Saudi Arabia and the occupation of Palestine, that pisses people off. They don't like that. That's why 9/11 happened. So if we're serious about preventing 9/11, then we should stop killing them. And that's my 2 cents. So that's a Christmas story, right? Bombing, Christmas Day bombings, the Christmas bombings in 1972 by Richard Nixon. Peace.